In the candlelit chambers of early America, where shadows danced against silk wallpaper and secrets whispered through mahogany halls, there lived a woman whose very presence could transform a room from battlefield to ballroom. She moved through the corridors of power not as a conqueror, but as an alchemist, transmuting political poison into social gold. Her laughter was currency, her hospitality a weapon more powerful than any sword. Behind fans of ostrich feathers and beneath layers of imported French silk, she wove a web of influence that would hold a young nation together when it threatened to tear itself apart. This was Dolley Madison, not merely a first lady, but the architect of American diplomacy, the keeper of presidential secrets, and the woman who understood that in politics, the most dangerous battles are often fought in drawing rooms over tea and whispered conversations that history would never record. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. In the spring of 1768, when the American colonies still bore the comfortable weight of British rule, and revolution was but a distant thunder on the horizon, a child was born who would one day hold the delicate threads of a nation's social fabric in her small, capable hands. Dorothea Payne entered the world in the Quaker settlement of New Garden, North Carolina, where the morning mist clung to the rolling hills like gossamer veils, and the only sounds that broke the sacred silence were the gentle lowing of cattle and the soft rustle of prayer bonnets in the meeting house. Her father, John Payne, was a man caught between two worlds, the prosperous plantation society that surrounded them and the austere principles of the Society of Friends that governed his conscience. He owned slaves, a contradiction that would gnaw at his Quaker soul like a persistent wound, yet he also possessed the quiet dignity that marked the truly devout. Her mother, Mary Coles Payne, carried herself with the grace of Virginia aristocracy, her bloodline tracing back to the first families of the colony, though she had willingly embraced the simple dress and plain speech of her husband's faith. Payne household existed in a state of careful tension, where the rigid simplicity of Quaker life brushed against the natural elegance that seemed to flow through Mary's very veins. Young Dolly, for she would never truly answer to Dorothea, absorbed both influences like a flower, drinking from two different streams. She learned to speak in the thee and thou of friends' speech, yet her eyes held a sparkle that suggested she saw beauty in things that were supposed to be invisible to the truly devout. When Dolly was still small enough to hide behind her mother's grey woolen skirts, the family made the journey north to Virginia, settling in Hanover County, where the red clay earth promised prosperity, and the society offered both challenge and opportunity to a Quaker family trying to live their principles in a world that often seemed designed to mock them. The plantation they established, called Scotchtown, had once belonged to Patrick Henry, that firebrand orator whose voice would soon call the colonies to revolution. The very walls seemed to hum with the echoes of political passion, though the Paynes filled them instead with the quiet rhythms of Quaker worship and the gentle cadences of family life. It was here, in the long, low-ceilinged rooms of Scotchtown, that Dolly first learned the art of observation that would serve her so well in the drawing rooms of Washington. She watched her mother navigate the delicate social requirements of Virginia plantation society, while maintaining the appearance of Quaker simplicity. Mary Payne might wear grey silk instead of coloured satin, but the cut of her gowns spoke to an understanding of fashion that transcended religious restriction. She might serve tea in plain pewter rather than painted china, but the ceremony itself was performed with such grace that guests forgot to notice the absence of luxury. From her, father Dolly learned the value of principle, even when principle came at great cost. John Payne's struggle with the institution of slavery played out in the fields and parlours of Scotchtown like a slow tragedy. He knew that his prosperity depended on the labour of men and women he could never truly own. Yet his faith demanded that he see them as equals before God. The contradiction ate away at him with the persistence of acid on metal, and young Dolly watched as he grew increasingly distant, his prayers longer, his silences deeper. The secret that the Payne family carried was not one of scandal or shame, but of slow transformation. While other plantation families built their fortunes on the backs of enslaved people without question or qualm, the Paynes wrestled with their conscience in the dark hours before dawn. Dolley would later remember the sound of her father's footsteps pacing the wide floorboards of his study, back and forth, like a caged animal seeking escape from his own moral prison. In 1783, when Dolley was 15 and the American Revolution had transformed the very soil beneath their feet, from British colony to American nation, John Payne made a decision that would change the course of his family's destiny. He freed his slaves, not in the gradual, reluctant manner of some conflicted masters, but all at once, in a gesture as bold and decisive as his Quaker faith demanded. The economic consequences were immediate and devastating. Without slave labor, Scotchtown could not sustain itself as a profitable plantation. The Payne family watched their comfortable world dissolve like sugar in rain. The decision to move to Philadelphia came not from choice, but from necessity. John Payne could no longer maintain his family in the manner to which they had become accustomed, and the Virginia society that had once welcomed them now viewed them with suspicion and subtle scorn. A man who freed his slaves for moral reasons was seen as either a saint or a fool, and Virginia society had little patience for either category. Philadelphia, that city of brotherly love, beckoned to the Paynes like a lighthouse to storm-tossed sailors. It was the largest city in America, a place where Quakers were not oddities, but pillars of society, where a man's conscience could guide his actions without social suicide. More importantly for the family's immediate needs, it was a place where John Payne might establish himself in trade or business, using the skills and connections he had developed as a planter to build a new life on different foundations. Philadelphia, in the 1780s, was a city drunk on its own importance and possibilities. It had been the birthplace of American independence, the seat of the Continental Congress, and now served as the temporary capital of the infant United States. The very air seemed charged with political electricity, and every coffeehouse conversation might reshape the future of a continent. Into this maelstrom of ambition and idealism, 17-year-old Dolley Payne stepped like a bird released from a cage she had never known was confining her. The family settled into a modest brick house on Arch Street, its red facade blending with the thousands of other red brick homes that gave Philadelphia its distinctive character. But if their dwelling was unremarkable from the outside, within its walls the Payne family continued to grapple with the tensions that had defined their Virginia years. John Payne attempted to establish himself as a merchant, but the habits of a planter did not easily translate to the quick reflexes and sharp calculations required for success in urban commerce. For Dolley, however, Philadelphia offered freedoms she had never imagined. The Quaker meeting house on Arch Street was filled with families like her own, prosperous, principled, and proud of their plain ways. But beyond the boundaries of Quaker society lay a world of such color and complexity that it made her previous. Life seemed like a painting rendered entirely in shades of gray. She began to understand that there were many ways to be American, many ways to be faithful, many ways to be a woman of virtue and substance. It was in Philadelphia that Dolley first encountered the concept of the Salon, those elegant gatherings where politics and poetry mingled like wine and water, where a woman's wit could command as much respect as a man's sword. Through her mother's connections to Virginia society, the Payne family occasionally received invitations to social gatherings that straddled the line between Quaker simplicity and worldly sophistication. Dolley observed these events with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts, noting how conversation flowed, how silences were filled, how conflicts were diffused with nothing more than a well-timed laugh or a graceful change of subject. The secret knowledge that Dolley began to accumulate during these Philadelphia years was not the kind found in books or sermons, but the subtle science of human nature. She learned to read the language written in the tilt of a head, the pause before a response, the way fingers drummed against a teacup. She began to understand that power in the drawing room operated by different rules than power in the meeting house or the marketplace, but that it was no less real for being unspoken Her father's merchant ventures struggled from the beginning. John Payne possessed the honesty and integrity that made him a good Quaker. But these same qualities often put him at a disadvantage in the cutthroat world of Philadelphia commerce. He was slow to collect debts from friends, quick to extend credit to those in need, and constitutionally unable to drive the hard bargains that might have ensured his success. The family's financial situation grew increasingly precarious, though they maintained the appearance of respectability through Mary Payne's careful management and Dolly's growing skill at making a little seem like much. It was during this period of financial uncertainty that Dolly first learned to navigate the treacherous waters of social economy. In Philadelphia's Quaker community, a family's worth was measured not only in material wealth but in spiritual capital. Their reputation for virtue, their contributions to the meeting, their adherence to the testimonies of simplicity, peace, and equality. The Payne family had lost much of their material prosperity, but they retained their spiritual standing, and Dolly discovered that this currency could be exchanged for opportunities that mere money could not buy. She began to attend more social gatherings, not as a passive observer but as an active participant. Her natural warmth and genuine interest in others made her welcome in drawing rooms where many Quaker young women would have felt awkward or out of place. She developed the ability to speak in the plain language of friends when among her co-religionists, yet adapt her conversation to the more elaborate style favoured in mixed company. This linguistic flexibility was more than mere social convenience. It was a form of diplomatic skill that would serve her throughout her life. The yellow fever epidemic of 1793 revealed another aspect of Dolly's character that would prove crucial to her future role as a national figure. When the disease swept through Philadelphia like a scythe through wheat, claiming thousands of lives and sending those who could afford it fleeing to the countryside, Dolly remained in the city. Along with other members of the Quaker community, she helped nurse the sick and care for the orphaned, work that brought her into contact with people from every level of Philadelphia society. During those terrible months, when the city's normal, social hierarchies broke down under the weight of shared suffering, Dolly learned lessons about leadership that no etiquette book could have taught. She discovered that in times of crisis, people looked not to the wealthiest or most powerful for guidance, but to those who demonstrated genuine compassion and unshakable calm. She learned that a woman who could maintain her composure while washing the fevered brow of a dying stranger possessed a kind of authority that transcended conventional notions of feminine propriety. It was also during the yellow fever crisis that Dolly first attracted the serious attention of John Todd Jr., a young Quaker lawyer whose family had been friends with the Paynes since their arrival in Philadelphia. Todd had noticed Dolly before. Her height, unusual for a woman of her era, made her difficult to overlook, and her animated conversation and ready laughter had marked her as different from the typical Quaker maiden. But it was her behavior during the epidemic, her willingness to risk her own life for others, that convinced him she was the woman he wanted to marry. John Todd was everything a Quaker family could want in a son-in-law. He was prosperous without being ostentatious, devout without being fanatical, and possessed of the kind of steady character that promised a lifetime of security for any woman fortunate enough to win his heart. His law practice was thriving, his reputation was spotless, and his prospects seemed unlimited. When he began to court Dolly in earnest, the Payne family could hardly believe their good fortune. The wedding of Dolly Payne and John Todd Jr. took place on January 7, 1790, in the simple meeting house where both families worshipped, according to the plain ceremony of the Society of Friends. There were no flowers, no music, no elaborate gown, only the solemn exchange of vows before God and the gathered community, followed by the signing of the marriage certificate that would bind two lives together in the sight of heaven and earth. Yet for all its simplicity, the ceremony marked a transformation in Dolly's life that was as profound as any fairy tale metamorphosis. As Mrs. John Todd, Dolly entered a world of comfortable respectability that seemed to promise an end to the financial uncertainties that had plagued her family. Todd's law practice was thriving, bringing him into contact with merchants, politicians, and other members of Philadelphia's professional class. His clients respected his judgment, His colleagues valued his counsel, and his income allowed the young couple to establish themselves in a pleasant house on Chestnut Street, complete with servants and the other amenities of middle-class prosperity. But comfort, Dolley discovered, could be its own kind of prison. The role of a Quaker wife was clearly defined and strictly bounded. She was expected to support her husband's career through her own exemplary conduct, to manage their household with efficiency and economy, and to raise their children in the faith and principles of their ancestors. There was no room in this pattern for the kind of social engagement that had begun to fascinate her during her unmarried years, no outlet for the political curiosity that Philadelphia's role as the national capital had awakened in her heart. The birth of her first son, John Payne Todd, in February 1792, brought Dolley the profound joy of motherhood, but also deepened her sense of domestic confinement. She threw herself into the role of mother with the same intensity she had once brought to nursing yellow fever victims, but part of her spirit seemed to wither in the narrow confines of nursery and parlour. She loved her child with fierce devotion, yet she could not help but wonder what other lives might have been possible for her in this city, where history was being written daily in the halls of Congress and the drawing rooms of the powerful. John Todd was a good husband by any reasonable standard. He was kind to his wife, devoted to his son, and faithful to his principles. But he was also a man of limited imagination, content with the boundaries that defined his world and uninterested in pushing beyond them. When Dolley expressed curiosity about the political debates raging in the capital, he gently but firmly reminded her that such matters were not appropriate concerns for a virtuous woman. When she suggested that they might accept some of the social invitations that came their way through his legal connections, he pointed out that such gatherings often involved frivolity and display that were inconsistent with Quaker testimonies. The secret life that Dolley began to live during her marriage to Todd was not one of scandal or deception, but of imagination and intellectual hunger. She read newspapers voraciously, following the bitter partisan battles between Federalists and Republicans with the intensity of a general studying enemy movements. She listened to the conversations of Todd's clients and colleagues, filing away information about the personalities and policies that were shaping the young nation. She began to understand that politics was not merely about laws and elections, but about human relationships, personal loyalties, and the delicate art of persuasion. When her second son, William Temple Todd, was born in the summer of 1793, Dolley experienced the complex emotions of a woman whose heart was divided between love and longing. She adored her children and took pride in her role as their mother, yet she could not escape the feeling that she was living only a fraction of the life that might have been possible for her. Philadelphia was the seat of government for a nation that was inventing itself as it went along, and she was confined to watching this great experiment from the narrow windows of domestic duty. The yellow fever epidemic of 1793 returned to Philadelphia with even greater vengeance than it had shown 3 years earlier. This time, Dolley was not free to volunteer her services as a nurse. She had 2 small children to protect and a husband whose legal practice required his presence in the city. The family debated whether to flee to the countryside, as many of their neighbors were doing. But Todd's sense of duty to his clients and his confidence in divine providence convinced him that they should remain. The decision proved fatal. In October 1793, both John Todd and baby William Temple fell victim to the disease that was devastating the city. Within the space of a few terrible weeks, Dolley found herself transformed from a comfortable wife and mother into a 25-year-old widow with a toddler son and no clear means of support. The man who had promised to care for her for the rest of her life was gone, taking with him not only her emotional security, but much of her financial stability as well. Todd's estate, while not negligible, was smaller than Dolley had expected, and complicated by debts and legal entanglements that would take years to resolve. The comfortable house on Chestnut Street would have to be given up, the servants dismissed, the lifestyle of bourgeois prosperity abandoned. Dolley faced the prospect of returning to her mother's household as a dependent daughter, her brief experiment, in independence reduced to a painful memory. But if the epidemic had taken much from Dolley, it had also taught her valuable lessons about her own resilience and resourcefulness. During the weeks when her husband and baby lay dying, she had discovered reserves of strength she had never known she possessed. She had made decisions, managed a household under siege, and faced the ultimate test of human endurance without breaking. The woman who emerged from this crucible was different from the sheltered Quaker wife who had entered it. Harder, perhaps, but also more confident in her ability to shape her own destiny. The year that followed Todd's death was a period of careful calculation for Dolley. On the surface, she appeared to be following the expected pattern of Quaker widowhood, living quietly with her mother and young son, wearing the grey and black of mourning, attending meeting with faithful regularity. But beneath this conventional exterior, she was conducting a subtle campaign to secure her future and that of her child. She cultivated friendships with the wives of prominent men, demonstrated her skills as a hostess at small gatherings, and gradually made it known that while she cherished her late husband's memory, she was not opposed to the possibility of remarriage to a suitable gentleman. The secret that Dolley guarded most carefully during this period was not any impropriety in her conduct, but the extent of her ambition. She had tasted the bitter herbs of dependency and financial uncertainty, and she was determined never to experience them again. Her next marriage, if it came, would be a partnership of equals, not a surrender of autonomy. She would choose a man who could offer her not just security, but opportunity, not just comfort, but the chance to play a role in the larger world that had always beckoned to her from beyond the narrow confines of Quaker domesticity. The Philadelphia of 1794 was still the capital of the United States, and the city hummed with the energy of men and women who were building a nation from the ground up. In the drawing rooms and dinner parties of this political elite, Dolley began to make appearances as a young widow of impeccable reputation and obvious intelligence. She was careful to maintain her Quaker principles in public, while allowing her natural charm and political curiosity to shine through in private conversation. She was, without quite realizing it, auditioning for a role that had never existed before in American society, that of a president's companion and partner. It was during one of these carefully orchestrated social appearances that Dolley first encountered James Madison, the diminutive congressman from Virginia, whose brilliant mind had already earned him the title Father of the Constitution. Madison was 17 years her senior, a lifelong bachelor who seemed more comfortable with books and ideas than with the social graces that came so naturally to Dolley. Yet there was something in his grave courtesy and penetrating intelligence that captured her attention from their first meeting. Here was a man whose conversation could range from the philosophical foundations of Republican government to the practical details of legislative compromise, who moved through the highest circles of power with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his own worth. The courtship that developed between Dolley Todd and James Madison was conducted according to rules that neither had quite expected to follow. She was a widow with a child. He was a middle-aged bachelor who had never shown serious interest in marriage. She was tall and vivacious. He was short and reserved. She was a Quaker, committed to simplicity and peace. He was a politician immersed in the complex machinations of party warfare. Yet somehow, in the space between their differences, they found a connection that surprised them both with its strength and inevitability. She had learned to navigate the delicate currents of grief, and now those same currents carried her toward an unexpected shore. The widow Dolley Todd found herself in a world where every glance held possibility, where every conversation might alter the course of her days. Philadelphia's society watched her with curious eyes, noting how she had emerged from mourning not broken, but somehow burnished by sorrow into something more luminous than before. In the late spring of 1794, when the dogwood trees scattered their white petals like fallen stars across the city's walkways, Dolley received an invitation that would forever change the rhythm of her heartbeat. Aaron Burr, that silver-tongued political architect who moved through Philadelphia's corridors of power like a cat through shadows, had asked if he might introduce her to a gentleman of particular distinction. The gentleman's name was James Madison, and even speaking it seemed to carry weight in the drawing rooms where such matters were discussed in whispers behind painted fans. Dolly had heard whispers of this James Madison long before their introduction was arranged. He was spoken of as the brilliant architect of the Constitution, a man whose mind moved like quicksilver through the labyrinthine passages of political philosophy. Yet the stories also painted him as painfully shy, a bachelor of 43 who had never married, who seemed more comfortable with books than with the social graces that governed polite society. She found herself curious about this contradiction. How could a man who had helped birth a nation be so retiring in the company of individuals? The meeting was arranged for a warm afternoon in May in the sunlit parlour of a mutual friend's home on Chestnut Street. Dolly dressed with particular care that day, choosing a gown of soft lavender silk that complemented her dark hair and made her eyes appear even more luminous. She had learned, in the months since her widowhood, that presentation was a language unto itself, and she had become fluent in its subtle vocabulary. When James Madison entered the room, Dolly felt something shift in the very air around her. He was smaller in stature than she had expected, his frame slight and almost scholarly in its delicacy. His hair was beginning to recede, and there was something owlish about his large, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Yet when he spoke, when he turned the full force of his attention upon her, she understood immediately why men twice his size deferred to his judgment in matters of state. Their conversation began with the safe topics that governed such introductions: the weather, the latest news from France, the progress of the yellow fever recovery efforts. But gradually, as they found their rhythm with one another, the talk turned to more substantial matters. Madison spoke of his travels through Virginia, of the debates that raged in Congress, of his dreams for the young nation they were all helping, or to shape. Dolly found herself responding not with the careful platitudes that had been her armor during those first months of widowhood, but with genuine curiosity and insight. What surprised her most was how easily they laughed together. James Madison, for all his reputation as a serious political philosopher, possessed a wit that was both gentle and incisive. He could find humor in the absurdities of political life, could craft an observation that made her see familiar things in entirely new ways. And Dolly discovered that her own natural vivacity, which she had feared might seem inappropriate for a woman still so recently in mourning, actually drew something lighter and more playful from the reserved statesman. They spoke of books. He was amazed by the breadth of her reading, she by the depth of his analysis. They discussed the theatre, and she was delighted to learn that this man of letters also appreciated the emotional truths that could be conveyed through performance. When the topic turned to religion, she found him respectful of her Quaker background, while sharing his own more philosophical approach to matters of faith and spirit. The afternoon passed like a dream, conversation flowing between them with the ease of old friends rather than new acquaintances. When it came time for them to part, James Madison bowed over her hand with a formality that somehow managed to convey both respect and an unmistakable warmth. "Mrs. Todd," he said, his voice carrying just the faintest tremor of feeling, "I hope you will permit me to call upon you again." Dolly felt her heart perform an unexpected flutter, like a bird testing its wings after a long winter. "I should be honored, Mr. Madison," she replied, her own voice steadier than she felt. As she walked home through the tree-lined streets of Philadelphia, Dolly found herself analyzing every word they had exchanged, every glance that had passed between them. She had not expected to feel such immediate connection with another person, had not imagined that conversation could feel so much like a dance in which both partners knew the steps instinctively. There was something about James Madison that called to the parts of herself she had nearly forgotten existed. The woman who loved ideas, who craved intellectual stimulation, who had always felt most alive when her mind was fully engaged. In the days that followed their first meeting, Dolly found herself walking through her daily routines with a new awareness, as if she were seeing her life through different eyes. The morning light seemed brighter as it streamed through her windows. The songs of the birds carried melodies she had not noticed before. She caught herself smiling at unexpected moments, her mind drifting to conversations they might have, topics they might explore together. James Madison proved to be a man of his word. Within a week, he had called upon her again, and this time their conversation ranged even more widely. He spoke of his plantation in Virginia, Montpelier, describing the rolling hills and ancient trees with the affection of a man deeply rooted in the land. She told him of her childhood in North Carolina, of the Quaker communities that had shaped her understanding of simplicity and service. They discovered shared interests in gardening, in architecture, in the delicate art of creating spaces where people could gather and feel at ease. What developed between them over the summer of 1794 was a courtship unlike anything Dolley had experienced before, where her relationship with John Todd had been built on shared faith and the comfortable expectations of their community. This new connection felt like an exploration of uncharted territory. James Madison courted her mind as much as her heart, bringing her books he thought she might enjoy, sharing drafts of letters he was writing to political colleagues, seeking her opinion on matters that range from foreign policy to the proper way to entertain international visitors. Their correspondence became the rhythm that governed Dolley's days. Madison's letters arrived with pleasing regularity, each one a carefully crafted jewel of observation and affection. He wrote to her of his work in Congress, but also of smaller moments, a particularly beautiful sunset over the Virginia countryside, a conversation with a farmer that had given him new insight into the challenges facing the young nation, a book he had discovered that he thought might amuse her. Dolley found herself writing back with increasing freedom and authenticity. At first, she had been careful to maintain the proper tone expected of a widow entertaining the attentions of a suitor. But gradually, as she sensed his genuine appreciation for her thoughts and observations, she began to share more of herself. She wrote to him of her concerns for her young son Payne, of her hopes for his education and future. She described the small details of her daily life, the way morning fog clung to the Delaware River, the laughter of children playing in the square outside her window, the satisfaction she found in managing her household with increasing confidence as summer deepened into autumn. Their relationship evolved beyond mere courtship into something that felt like partnership. Madison began seeking her advice on social matters, recognizing that her natural grace and intuitive understanding of people complemented his own more analytical approach to human relationships. When he described the dinner parties and receptions that were an inevitable part of political life, Dolley found herself offering suggestions for guest lists, menu planning, even the arrangement of furniture to encourage conversation. She discovered that she possessed an unexpected gift for understanding the social dynamics that surrounded political life, where James could analyze the constitutional implications of a piece of legislation or predict how various states might respond to federal initiatives. Dolley could sense the personal relationships and private motivations that often determined how such matters would actually unfold. She understood that politics was ultimately about people, and people were most effectively influenced when they felt comfortable, respected, and heard. The autumn of 1794 brought both joy and complexity to their deepening relationship. Dolley's Quaker community, which had embraced her during her widowhood, began to express concern about her association with a man outside their faith. The Society of Friends had strict rules about marriage between members and those of other denominations, and whispers began to circulate about whether Dolley's friendship with the Episcopal Madison was becoming something more serious. For Dolley, this presented a painful dilemma. The Quaker community had been her anchor through the darkest period of her life, providing not only emotional support, but also practical assistance as she learned to navigate widowhood. The idea of potentially losing that connection, of being read out of meeting for marrying outside the faith, caused her genuine anguish. Yet she found herself increasingly unable to imagine a future that did not include James Madison. Madison, for his part, was sensitive to the difficulty of her position. He never pressured her to make any decisions quickly, never suggested that her faith was an obstacle to be overcome rather than a cherished part of who she was. Instead, he seemed to understand that any choice she made needed to emerge from her own deep consideration of her values, her future, and her heart's true calling. The winter months of 1794 and early 1795 brought a crystalline clarity to Dolly's contemplation of her future. Snow covered Philadelphia like a blanket of silence, creating a sense of suspended time that allowed her to examine her heart without the distractions of busier seasons. She spent long hours in her parlor, sometimes reading the books James had recommended, sometimes simply sitting by the fire and allowing her thoughts to move through the possibilities that lay before her. During this period of reflection, Dolly came to understand something fundamental about the nature of love and choice. Her marriage to John Todd had been, in many ways, a choice made by a young woman who accepted the path that seemed most natural and appropriate for someone of her background and circumstances. But this potential union with James Madison felt entirely different. It was a choice that would require her to actively shape her own destiny, to decide who she wanted to become rather than simply accepting who others expected her to be. She recognized that marrying James Madison would mean more than simply gaining a husband. It would mean entering a world where she would be called upon to play a public role, to serve as a partner not just to a man, but to a cause. Madison's position in the new government meant that his wife would inevitably become a figure of national interest, someone whose every action would be observed and interpreted as a reflection of the administration's values and priorities. The prospect both thrilled and intimidated her. Dolly had always possessed natural social gifts, but she had never imagined herself as someone who might influence national affairs. Yet, as she considered the possibility, she began to see ways in which her skills could serve not just her husband's career, but the broader project of building a unified nation from the disparate colonies that had won their independence. She understood intuitively that the new American Republic needed more than just laws and institutions to hold it together. It needed customs and traditions, social rituals that would help create a sense of shared identity among people from vastly different regions and backgrounds. The dinner parties and receptions that seemed merely social on the surface could actually serve as crucial forums for building the personal relationships that would enable political cooperation. Throughout that winter, James Madison continued his patient courtship, never rushing her toward a decision, but making it clear through word and deed that his feelings had only deepened with time. He spent Christmas in Philadelphia rather than returning to Virginia, as was his custom, and they attended several holiday gatherings together. At these events, Dolly began to see how they functioned as a couple in public settings, and she was pleased to discover that their natural compatibility extended beyond private conversation to the more complex dynamics of social leadership. She watched how Madison interacted with other political figures, noting his skill at finding common ground between men who might otherwise view each other as adversaries. She observed how he could draw out the best insights from a group discussion, how he could defuse tension with a well-placed comment or redirect conversation when it veered toward unproductive conflict. And she began to see how her own gifts might complement his, how her warmth and intuitive understanding of people could help create the atmosphere that would allow his intellectual leadership to flourish. The turning point came on a snowy evening in February when they attended a reception at the home of Robert Morris, one of Philadelphia's most prominent citizens. The gathering included many of the era's most influential figures: Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, men whose decisions would shape the nation's future. Dolly found herself naturally gravitating toward the wives and daughters of these leaders, women who were themselves navigating the uncharted waters of what it meant to be prominent in the new republic. As she moved through the evening's conversations, Dolly experienced a moment of profound recognition. She realized that she was not merely observing this world of national politics and social influence. She was participating in it, contributing to it, helping to shape its character through her own presence and actions. The realization came not as a burden, but as a calling, a sense that she had found the role she was meant to play in the grand experiment of American democracy. When James Madison approached her later that evening, offering his arm to escort her into dinner, she felt a surge of certainty that seemed to settle every doubt that had plagued her through the long winter months. This was not just a choice between two different men or two different ways of life. It was a choice about who she wanted to become. how she wanted to use the gifts she had been given, what kind of legacy she wanted to leave behind. Spring returned to Philadelphia with unusual splendor in 1795, as if nature itself was celebrating the possibilities that seemed to shimmer in the warming air. Dolley made her decision on a morning when cherry blossoms drifted past her window like snow, covering the ground with a carpet of pink and white petals that seemed to promise renewal and transformation. She wrote to James Madison that day, a letter that required several drafts before she could capture the right balance of formality and feeling. In careful, elegant script, she accepted his proposal of marriage, but she also shared with him her understanding of what such a union would mean. She was not simply agreeing to become his wife. She was accepting a partnership that would place them both at the center of the young nation's political and social life. She was choosing to step into a role that had no precedent, to help define what it meant to be a leader's wife in a democratic republic. Madison's response arrived by return post, and his joy radiated from every carefully chosen word. But beyond his personal happiness, his letter revealed his own understanding of the significance of her decision. He wrote of his hopes that together they might help establish customs and traditions that would serve the Republic well, that their home might become a place where the business of governance could be conducted with both effectiveness and grace. The decision to marry James Madison meant that Dolley would indeed be read out of the Quaker meeting, a painful consequence that she accepted with resignation rather than resentment. She understood that the Society of Friends needed to maintain its distinctiveness, its commitment to plain living and separation from worldly power. But she also knew that her own path was leading her in a different direction, toward a life where she could serve larger purposes while remaining true to the core values of simplicity, service, and genuine care for others that her Quaker upbringing had instilled in her. Their wedding took place on September 15th, 1795, in a ceremony that balanced James's Episcopal traditions with Dolley's desire for relative simplicity. The celebration was elegant but not ostentatious, reflecting their shared understanding that while their union was personally joyful, it also carried public responsibilities that required a certain dignity and restraint. As Dolley stood beside James Madison and spoke the words that would bind their lives together, she felt herself crossing a threshold that led not just into marriage, but into an entirely new identity. She was no longer simply Dolley Todd, the young Quaker widow who had survived personal tragedy with grace and determination. She was becoming Dolley Madison, a woman whose actions would be watched and interpreted as reflections of the new republic's character and values. The weeks following their wedding were spent in preparation for a new life that would be divided between Philadelphia during the congressional session and Montpelier during the summer months. Dolley threw herself into learning about Virginia plantation life, studying the complex dynamics of managing a large household that included enslaved workers. This aspect of her new life presented moral complexities that troubled her Quaker-trained conscience, but she approached these challenges with the same thoughtfulness and determination she brought to all difficult situations. She spent hours talking with James about the realities of plantation life, the economics that made the system seem necessary to Virginia planters, and the moral questions that such arrangements inevitably raised. Madison himself was conflicted about slavery, recognizing its inconsistency with the principles of liberty and equality upon which the nation had been founded, yet feeling trapped by economic realities and social expectations that made immediate change seem impossible. Dolley's approach to these complexities reflected the practical wisdom that would characterize her entire public life. She could not single-handedly resolve the contradictions between American ideals and American practices, but she could work to ensure that the enslaved people under her authority were treated with as much dignity and kindness as circumstances allowed. She made it her business to learn the names and personal situations of every worker at Montpelier, to provide what assistance she could when families faced illness or other crises, and to maintain standards of living that reflected her belief in the fundamental humanity of all people. As autumn deepened and the time approached for their departure to Virginia, Dolley found herself both excited and apprehensive about the next phase of her life. She was leaving behind the familiar rhythms of Philadelphia, the Quaker community that had shaped her youth, the independence she had claimed during her years of widowhood. She was stepping into a role that had no clear precedent, in a world where the expectations for political wives were still being defined. Yet she felt ready for the challenge. The months of courtship had shown her that she and James Madison functioned effectively as a team, that their different strengths complemented each other in ways that could serve both their personal happiness and their public responsibilities. She had discovered in herself a capacity for political and social leadership that she had never suspected, and she was eager to explore how those abilities might contribute to the great experiment of American democracy. On the morning of their departure from Philadelphia, as their carriage rolled through streets that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat, Dolley felt the weight of transformation settling around her like a new garment. She was no longer simply a private individual making choices for her own happiness and security. She had become a public figure, someone whose actions would be scrutinized and interpreted as reflections of her husband's political positions and the administration's character. The responsibility was daunting, but it was also exhilarating. As the carriage wheels carried them southward toward Virginia and the next chapter of their lives, Dolley Madison, for she was now fully and completely Dolley Madison, felt herself poised on the brink of discoveries she could not yet imagine. She had chosen love over security, partnership over independence, public service over private comfort. The consequences of those choices would unfold in ways that would surprise not only the watching nation, but Dolley herself. The dawn of 1801 brought with it winds of change that swept through the young capital, like autumn leaves dancing in the Potomac breeze. Thomas Jefferson, the philosopher-president, had taken residence in the still unfinished executive mansion, its walls echoing with the promise of democratic ideals and the quiet footsteps of servants moving through rooms that would one day witness the birth pangs of a nation's destiny. Yet in those early days of his presidency, something was missing from the grand chambers. The gentle touch of a woman's hand, the soft rustle of silk against mahogany, the delicate art of making strangers into friends. It was then that Jefferson, with the wisdom of a man who understood that politics was as much about hearts as minds, turned his gaze toward his Secretary of State's wife. James Madison, brilliant though he was, possessed neither the physical stature nor the social grace to command a room filled with foreign dignitaries and congressional wives. But Dolley possessed something far more valuable than political acumen or constitutional knowledge. She possessed the rare gift of making every person she met feel as though they were the most important soul in the world. The invitation came on a crisp February morning, delivered by a young clerk whose hands trembled slightly as he placed the presidential seal into Dolley's palm. Jefferson requested her presence at the president's house to serve as his hostess for official functions. It was an unprecedented request. Never before had a president asked another man's wife to fill such a role. Yet as Dolley read the elegant script, she understood that she was being offered something far greater than a social position. She was being invited to help shape the very character of American democracy through the ancient art of hospitality. The dawn of 1801 brought with it winds of change that swept through the young capital like autumn leaves dancing in the Potomac breeze. Thomas Jefferson, the philosopher-president, had taken residence in the still unfinished executive mansion, its walls echoing with the promise of democratic ideals and the quiet footsteps of servants moving through rooms that would one day witness the birth pangs of a nation's destiny. Yet in those early days of his presidency, something was missing from the grand chambers. The gentle touch of a woman's hand, the soft rustle of silk against mahogany, the delicate art of making strangers into friends. It was then that Jefferson, with the wisdom of a man who understood that politics was as much about hearts as minds, turned his gaze toward his Secretary of State's wife. James Madison, brilliant though he was, possessed neither the physical stature nor the social grace to command a room filled with foreign dignitaries and congressional wives. But Dolley possessed something far more valuable than political acumen or constitutional knowledge. She possessed the rare gift of making every person she met feel as though they were the most important soul in the world. The invitation came on a crisp February morning, delivered by a young clerk, whose hands trembled slightly as he placed the presidential seal into Dolly's palm. Jefferson requested her presence at the president's house to serve as his hostess for official functions. It was an unprecedented request. Never before had a president asked another man's wife to fill such a role. Yet as Dolly read the elegant script, she understood that she was being offered something far greater than a social position. She was being invited to help shape the very character of American democracy through the ancient art of hospitality. James, when presented with the request, simply smiled that quiet smile of his and nodded. He had long understood that his wife possessed talents that complemented his own in ways that made them a formidable partnership. Where he crafted policy in the shadows of his study, she would build bridges in the light of the drawing room. Where he spoke to men's minds through reasoned argument, she would speak to their hearts through genuine warmth and interest. And so began what history would remember as one of the most remarkable periods in American social diplomacy, though few would ever know the full extent of Dolly's secret influence on the affairs of state. For while the world saw a charming hostess arranging flowers and serving tea, the truth was far more complex. Dolley Madison had become, in all but name, America's first female diplomat, wielding her social skills like the most delicate of surgical instruments to advance her husband's political agenda and, by extension, the cause of democratic government itself. The president's house in those days was a peculiar mixture of grandeur and incompleteness. The East Room, intended for grand receptions, remained unfinished, its walls bearing the scars of hasty construction and its floors covered with sawdust that caught the light filtering through tall, unshuttered windows. The other rooms, while more complete, bore the austere mark of Jefferson's Republican sensibilities. Elegant but not ostentatious, refined but not royal. Into this space, Dolly brought a transformation that was both subtle and profound. She understood instinctively that the way a nation entertained its guests spoke volumes about its character and values. Under her guidance, the weekly drawing room receptions became masterpieces of democratic theatre, where cabinet members mingled with common citizens, where foreign ministers found themselves in conversation with frontier representatives, where the rigid protocols of European courts gave way to the warm inclusivity of American ideals. Her preparations for these events were meticulous, though she took great care to make them appear effortless. Days before each reception, she would walk through the rooms of the president's house, her trained eye noting every detail, the placement of chairs to encourage conversation, the selection of refreshments that would appeal to diverse palates, the arrangement of candles to create an atmosphere both formal and welcoming. She studied the guest lists like a general studying maps before battle, noting which foreign diplomats might benefit from introduction to which congressional leaders, which social rivals might be placed far enough apart to avoid unpleasantness, which shy wives might be drawn into conversation by which gregarious hostesses. But perhaps most importantly, she studied the secrets that men and women carried in their hearts, their ambitions and fears, their loyalties and resentments, their hopes for the future and their memories of the past. For Dolly had learned during her years in Philadelphia that people revealed their true selves not in formal speeches or official documents, but in the unguarded moments between the serving of wine and the lighting of after-dinner cigars, in the casual conversations that bloomed in parlor corners and died away in carriage rides home. Her intelligence network was vast and invisible, composed not of paid spies or official informants, but of the countless women who moved through Washington. Society, like a gentle current beneath the surface of political life. Wives confided in her their husbands' secret concerns. Daughters shared their father's private conversations. Servants, treated with unprecedented kindness in the Madison household, brought word of discussions overheard in other prominent homes. Society hostesses, grateful for Dolly's inclusive approach to guest lists, shared the gossip that flowed through their own drawing rooms like water through a sieve. Through this network of whispered confidences and subtle observations, Dolly accumulated a treasure trove of information that would have been invaluable to any intelligence service. She knew which congressmen were wavering on important votes and why. She understood the personal grievances that lay behind political opposition, the family scandals that might influence public positions, the financial pressures that could make honest men vulnerable to compromise. Most remarkably, she had discovered that many of the most important negotiations in Washington took place not in the formal chambers of government, but in the informal settings of social life. A foreign minister might reveal his government's true position during a casual conversation at a dinner party. A senator might let slip his real concerns about a pending bill while dancing with the Secretary of State's charming wife. A Supreme Court justice might inadvertently reveal his thinking on a constitutional question while sharing a quiet moment of conversation in a corner of Dolley's drawing room. The winter of 1803 brought with it challenges that would test every skill Dolley had developed in the delicate art of political hospitality. The Louisiana Purchase negotiations were entering their most crucial phase, and the future of American expansion hung in the balance like morning mist over the Potomac. Napoleon's representatives had arrived in Washington with instructions that remained tantalizingly unclear, while Spanish diplomats watched nervously from the sidelines, their own territorial claims trembling in the balance of great power politics. It was during this period that Dolley's role evolved from that of mere hostess to something approaching that of a secret agent in silk and lace. The French minister, Louis-André Pichon, had proven himself particularly susceptible to feminine charm, a weakness that Dolley recognized and exploited, with the skill of a master chess player moving pieces across an invisible board. During the elaborate dinner parties that she organized in the French minister's honor, she would seat herself strategically within earshot of his conversations, her fan fluttering gently as she appeared to focus her attention on the ladies around her while her keen ears captured every nuance of diplomatic discussion. She had learned to read the subtle language of international diplomacy, the way a minister's voice would drop when discussing sensitive subjects, the telltale pause that preceded a significant revelation, the careful choice of words that revealed far more than their speakers intended. When Pichon mentioned, seemingly in passing, that his government was facing unexpected difficulties in the Caribbean, Dolley understood immediately that Napoleon's dreams of a North American empire were crumbling under the pressure of slave rebellions in Haiti. When the Spanish ambassador expressed concern about certain territorial boundaries, she recognized the fear of a nation watching its colonial empire slowly slip away like sand through desperate fingers. But information gathering was only half of Dolley's secret mission. The other half involved the far more delicate task of planting ideas and influencing opinions without leaving any trace of her involvement. She had perfected the art of the innocent question, the casual observation that would send a listener's thoughts racing in precisely the direction she intended. A comment about the beauty of New Orleans architecture might lead a French diplomat to reflect on the practical difficulties of governing such a distant territory. An observation about the impressive energy of American settlers might cause a Spanish official to consider the inevitable consequences of resisting westward expansion. Her methods were so subtle that even James, brilliant though he was, sometimes failed to recognize the full extent of his wife's contributions to their shared political project. He would arrive home from difficult negotiations to find that the foreign minister with whom he had been sparring had somehow become more amenable to American positions. Opposition senators who had seemed intractable would suddenly express new openness to compromise. Critical pieces of information would surface at precisely the moments when they were most needed, delivered through channels so indirect that their ultimate source remained hidden in the mists of social conversation. The British Embassy presented particular challenges, for the representatives of His Majesty's government were trained in their own sophisticated arts of diplomatic intrigue. Ambassador Anthony Merry and his wife Elizabeth had arrived in Washington with preconceptions about American society that Dolley set about systematically dismantling through carefully orchestrated social encounters. She recognized that British condescension toward American manners and customs was not merely a matter of social snobbery, but a strategic attitude designed to reinforce their position as the superior party in all negotiations. Dolley's response was characteristically indirect, but devastatingly effective. Rather than challenging British assumptions directly, She simply arranged for the Marys to witness American society at its most impressive. She invited them to intimate dinners where they found themselves in conversation with men like Alexander Hamilton, whose intellectual brilliance could match any European's, or John Marshall, whose legal reasoning was already becoming legendary. She orchestrated musical evenings where they heard American composers whose work rivaled anything being produced in London. She arranged for them to witness the democratic process in action, watching as common citizens engaged in political discussions, with a sophistication that would have surprised many Europeans who believed that ordinary people were incapable of self-governance. The transformation in British attitudes was gradual but unmistakable. Ambassador Mary's dispatches to London, which had initially dripped with condescension toward American provincialism, began to take on a more respectful tone. His wife, Elizabeth, who had arrived expecting to find herself surrounded by uncouth colonials, discovered instead a society that, while different from her own, possessed its own forms of refinement and elegance. By the time their tour of duty was complete, both Marys had become unexpected advocates for the American perspective within British diplomatic circles. But perhaps Dolly's greatest triumph during this period was her management of the complex relationship between the Federalist opposition and the Jefferson administration. The Federalists, led by men like Alexander Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris, viewed Jefferson's presidency with deep suspicion, seeing in his democratic rhetoric the seeds of dangerous radicalism that might lead to the kind of social upheaval that had torn apart revolutionary France. Their opposition to administration policies was fierce and sometimes personal, threatening to tear apart the fragile fabric of American political unity. Dolly recognized that this opposition could not be overcome through political argument alone. The Federalists' fears ran too deep, their memories of revolutionary violence too vivid, their loyalty to hierarchical social structures too profound. Instead, she set about the more subtle task of humanizing Jefferson and his allies in Federalist eyes, of demonstrating through personal interaction that Democratic politicians were not dangerous radicals, but thoughtful patriots who shared many of the same values and concerns as their political opponents. She accomplished this through a series of informal social gatherings that brought together political adversaries in settings designed to minimize partisan tensions. A musical evening where Federalist and Republican wives found common ground in their shared love of Mozart. A botanical excursion where political opponents discovered mutual interests in natural philosophy. Quiet dinners where the conversation moved from political theory to family concerns, from constitutional interpretation to shared memories of the struggle for independence. These gatherings served a dual purpose. On the surface, they appeared to be nothing more than the kind of social entertainment that any prominent hostess might arrange. Beneath the surface, they were sophisticated exercises in political reconciliation, designed to weave together the social fabric that political competition threatened to tear apart. Dolly understood that democracy could not survive if political differences hardened into personal hatreds, if partisan competition destroyed the bonds of mutual respect that held the Republic together. Her success in this endeavor was perhaps best measured not in any single dramatic achievement, but in the gradual mellowing of political discourse that occurred during Jefferson's presidency. The vicious personal attacks that had characterized the election of 1800 gave way to a more civilized form of political competition. Opposition to administration policies remained vigorous, but it was expressed in constitutional rather than personal terms. The peaceful transfer of power that had seemed so uncertain during the election crisis was repeated again and again as political. Opponents learned to accept electoral defeat without questioning the legitimacy of the system itself. Yet even as Dolly worked to bridge political divisions at home, she was equally engaged in the complex dance of international diplomacy. The Napoleonic Wars were reshaping the European political landscape, creating opportunities and dangers for American interests that required the most delicate handling. British naval supremacy posed constant threats to American commerce, while French continental dominance created its own set of diplomatic challenges. Neutral rights became not merely a matter of international law, but a question of national survival for a young republic caught between the grinding millstones of great power conflict. It was during this period that Dolley's social gatherings took on an almost theatrical quality, as representatives of warring European powers found themselves sharing the same rooms, eating from the same tables, and engaging in the same polite conversations, while their governments plotted each other's destruction across the Atlantic. French ministers would discuss literature with British attachés, while their respective fleets fought savage battles on distant seas. Spanish diplomats would share wine with American officials while secretly corresponding with British agents about potential alliances against American expansion. Dolley moved through these gatherings like a conductor leading an invisible orchestra, her subtle gestures and carefully chosen words helping to maintain the delicate balance that kept diplomatic relations functioning, despite the larger conflicts that raged beyond American shores. She understood that each social interaction was a small piece in a larger puzzle, that a well-timed compliment might prevent a diplomatic incident, that a gracefully managed introduction might open channels of communication that formal negotiations had failed to establish. By 1805, Dolley Madison had become something unprecedented in American history, a woman who wielded significant political influence without holding any official position, who shaped national policy without leaving any formal record of her involvement, who moved through the corridors of power like a gentle ghost, whose presence was felt everywhere but whose methods remained invisible to all but the most careful observers. Her transformation from Philadelphia Quaker matron to Washington power broker was now complete, yet the very completeness of that transformation had created new challenges and dangers. As her influence grew, so did the number of people who began to suspect that Dolley Madison was far more than the charming hostess she appeared to be. Political opponents started to watch her more carefully. Foreign diplomats began to analyze her guest lists and seating arrangements for hidden meanings, and even some of her closest friends began to wonder about the source of her seemingly intuitive understanding of political developments. The most dangerous of these observers was Aaron Burr, the former vice president whose own political ambitions had been thwarted by his duel with Alexander Hamilton, and who now moved through Washington society like a predator seeking new opportunities for mischief. Burr possessed his own considerable skills in the art of social manipulation, and he recognized in Dolley a kindred spirit whose methods, while more subtle than his own, were potentially even more effective. During one particularly memorable evening at the president's house, Burr cornered Dolley during a quiet moment between musical performances, his dark eyes gleaming with amusement as he complimented her on the remarkable insights she had shared. During a recent conversation with the British minister, "My dear Mrs. Madison," he murmured, his voice carrying just enough innuendo to be unmistakably threatening, "I do believe you have missed your calling. With such talents for gathering and interpreting information, you might have made an excellent spy." Dolley's response was characteristically brilliant in its simplicity. She laughed, a light, musical sound that carried just the right note of feminine bewilderment. "Oh, Colonel Burr, you do say the most amusing things. I'm afraid I must disappoint you, but I know nothing more than any hostess learns from her guests. People do tend to become quite talkative when they're comfortable, don't you find?" Her fan fluttered gently as she spoke, and her blue eyes widened with such apparent innocence that even Burr, master manipulator though he was, found himself momentarily disarmed. But the encounter served as a warning that Dolley's activities were not going entirely unnoticed. She began to exercise even greater care in her methods, developing new techniques for gathering information that left even fewer traces of her involvement. Instead of engaging foreign diplomats in direct conversation about sensitive topics, she would arrange for other guests to ask the pertinent questions, while she appeared to be focused on entirely different matters. Rather than seeking information directly, she would create social situations that encouraged her targets to reveal what she needed to know through seemingly spontaneous revelations. Her mastery of this invisible art reached its peak during the complex negotiations that surrounded the Chesapeake Leopard affair of 1807, when a British warship attacked an American naval vessel in what amounted to an act of war. The incident inflamed American public opinion and brought the two nations closer to armed conflict than they had been since the Revolution. President Jefferson faced enormous pressure to respond with military force, while more moderate voices counseled restraint and diplomatic solutions. Dolley recognized that the crisis offered both enormous dangers and unexpected opportunities. War with Britain would be catastrophic for the young republic, potentially destroying everything that had been built since independence. Yet the crisis also provided leverage that, if properly used, might force the British to moderate their high-handed treatment of American commercial interests. The key was to find a solution that satisfied American honor without triggering a conflict that the nation was not prepared to fight. Her approach to this challenge revealed the full sophistication of her political methods. Rather than attempting to influence policy directly, she set about shaping the social and political environment within which policy decisions would be made. She organized a series of carefully planned social events designed to bring together all the key players in the crisis, creating opportunities for informal discussion and negotiation that formal diplomatic channels could not provide. The centerpiece of this effort was an elaborate dinner party, ostensibly held to celebrate the anniversary of American independence. The guest list was a masterpiece of strategic thinking, bringing together administration officials, congressional leaders, foreign diplomats, and influential private citizens in combinations that would have been impossible to arrange through official channels. British representatives found themselves seated next to war hawks who had been calling for immediate military action, while moderate Republicans were placed in conversation with Federalists who favored closer ties to Britain. Throughout the evening, Dolley moved among her guests like a master diplomat, her conversations apparently focused on trivial social matters, while her real attention was fixed on the undercurrents of political discussion that flowed beneath the surface of polite entertainment. A word here, a gesture there, a strategically timed introduction, or a gracefully managed separation. Each small action was designed to encourage the kind of informal communication that might lead to diplomatic solutions. The results of her efforts became apparent over the following weeks as the crisis began to cool rather than escalate. British officials, having been exposed to the full range of American opinion through Dolley's social gatherings, began to understand that their government's aggressive policies were producing exactly the kind of anti-British sentiment that served no one's interests. American officials, having had opportunities for frank but private discussions with their British counterparts, began to appreciate the domestic political pressures that limited British flexibility on issues like impressment and neutral rights. Most importantly, the informal networks of communication that Dolley had established continued to function even after the immediate crisis had passed, providing channels for ongoing dialogue that helped prevent future incidents from escalating into major confrontations. Her drawing room had become, in effect, an unofficial diplomatic venue where representatives of different nations could meet and talk without the formal constraints that often made official negotiations so difficult. Yet even as she achieved these diplomatic triumphs, Dolley was facing growing challenges in her personal life that threatened to complicate her political activities. Her son Payne, now approaching manhood, had begun to show signs of the same weakness for gambling and strong drink that had destroyed so many young men of his generation. Her worries about his future were compounded by financial pressures that stemmed partly from James's modest government salary and partly from the considerable expenses associated with their elaborate entertaining. These personal concerns might have distracted a lesser woman from her political activities, but Dolley possessed the rare ability to compartmentalize her emotions, to maintain her public composure and effectiveness, even while dealing with private pain. If anything, her personal struggles seemed to deepen her understanding of human nature, making her even more effective at reading the hidden concerns and motivations that drove the behavior of the powerful men and women who surrounded her. She also began to recognize that her influence, however considerable, was ultimately dependent on her husband's position and political fortunes. As James approached the end of his service as Secretary of State and began to contemplate a presidential campaign of his own, Dolley understood that the nature of her role would need to evolve once again. The skills that had made her an effective hostess for President Jefferson would need to be adapted to the very different requirements of a presidential candidate's wife. The prospect both excited and daunted her. On one hand, becoming First Lady in her own right would provide her with a platform for influence that no American woman had ever possessed. On the other hand, it would also expose her to a level of scrutiny that might make her current methods of operation impossible to maintain. The invisible influence she had wielded as the Secretary of State's wife might become far more difficult to exercise as the president's wife, surrounded by official protocol and public attention. As 1808 approached and James's presidential ambitions became increasingly apparent, Dolley began to prepare for yet another transformation in her already remarkable career. The Quaker girl who had once swept the floors of her father's starch business was about to become the most powerful woman in America, though few would ever understand the true nature or extent of her influence. The secret life she had built for herself in the shadows of power was about to be tested by the full glare of presidential prominence. But as she contemplated the challenges that lay ahead, Dolley Madison could reflect with satisfaction on what she had already accomplished. Through 8 years of patient work, she had helped to establish the social foundations of American democracy, had contributed to the peaceful resolution of numerous diplomatic crises, and had played a crucial role in maintaining the political stability that allowed the young republic to survive its most dangerous early years. Her methods had been so subtle that few contemporaries fully understood her contributions, but the results spoke for themselves in the strengthened institutions and more civilized political discourse that marked American public life by the end of Jefferson's presidency. The stage was now set for the most challenging and significant phase of Dolley Madison's secret career. Her years as First Lady during one of the most turbulent periods in American history. The skills she had developed and the network she had built would soon be tested by war, invasion, and the near collapse of the federal government itself. Yet she would meet these challenges with the same combination of charm, intelligence, and steely determination that had already made her one of the most influential women in American history, even though her true story would remain hidden for generations to come. And through these carefully cultivated relationships, she had begun to weave something far more intricate than mere social pleasantries. In the shadows of her glittering receptions, Dolley Madison was building an intelligence network that would prove invaluable to her husband's presidency and to the young nation itself. The year 1811 brought whispers of war like distant thunder rolling across the political landscape of Washington. In the drawing rooms where Dolley held court, conversations that had once revolved around fashion and literature now carried the weight of impending conflict. The British Navy's continued impressment of American sailors had pushed relations between the two nations to a breaking point, and in the halls of Congress, the warhawks cried for action with increasing fervor. Dolley moved through these turbulent waters with the grace of a ship's captain who had long studied the winds. Her Wednesday evening receptions became more than social gatherings. They transformed into informal councils of war, where information flowed as freely as the wine. She had learned to read the subtle language of politics, the way a diplomat's eyes would shift when discussing British naval movements, the tension in a senator's voice when speaking of Western territories, the careful silences that fell when certain names were mentioned. Through her network of correspondents, many of them women whose husbands occupied positions of influence, Dolley gathered intelligence that would never appear in official dispatches. A merchant's wife in Baltimore might mention the unusual number of British ships spotted off the coast. A diplomat's daughter in Philadelphia could relay conversations overheard at European embassy gatherings. The widow of a naval officer might share concerns about harbor defenses. Each piece of information, seemingly insignificant on its own, became part of a larger tapestry that Dolley wove with patient, invisible hands. James, absorbed in the mounting pressures of his office, often found himself turning to his wife for insights that went beyond official reports. In the quiet hours of their private chambers, when the candles burned low and the weight of presidential responsibility pressed heavily upon his shoulders, Dolley would share what she had learned in ways that seemed natural, even casual. A comment about a conversation she'd had with the French minister's wife, an observation about the mood among the congressional wives, a concern expressed by a merchant about shipping routes. James had come to understand that his wife possessed a unique gift for gathering information that formal channels often missed. Where diplomats spoke in careful, coded language, Dolley heard the unguarded truths that emerged in moments of social intimacy. Where official reports presented only facts and figures, she provided the human element, the fears, hopes, and hidden motivations that drove political decisions. As tensions with Britain escalated throughout 1811 and into 1812, Dolley's role as an informal intelligence gatherer became increasingly crucial. She began to host smaller, more intimate gatherings alongside her larger receptions, carefully curating guest lists that would bring together individuals whose conversations might prove illuminating. A dinner party might include a British expatriate with connections to the embassy, a French émigré with insights into European politics, and an American merchant with knowledge of maritime conditions, all carefully orchestrated to encourage the kind of discussion that would reveal strategic information. The President's house itself became a carefully designed stage for these operations. Dolley had arranged the rooms to facilitate both large gatherings and private conversations. Alcoves provided spaces for confidential discussions, while the main drawing rooms allowed her to observe multiple conversations simultaneously. She had developed an extraordinary ability to appear engaged in one discussion while listening to another. Her keen intelligence, processing multiple streams of information at once. Her correspondence network had grown to span the entire eastern seaboard, with contacts in every major port city and many smaller communities. These women, many of whom had become genuine friends through years of correspondence, provided Dolley with a constant flow of information about everything from ship movements to public sentiment. She maintained these relationships through a careful balance of personal interest and subtle inquiry, never appearing to probe too deeply, but always listening with the attention that made people want to share their secrets. The intelligence Dolley gathered often found its way to James through seemingly innocent conversations. During their morning walks in the President's garden, she might mention a concern raised by a naval officer's wife about harbour fortifications. Over breakfast, she could share news from a merchant's spouse about British naval activity. These casual exchanges allowed James to pursue formal verification of information without revealing its source, protecting both Dolley's network and the individuals who had unknowingly contributed to it. As spring turned to summer in 1812, the signs of approaching war became unmistakable. Congress had declared war against Britain on June 18th, and suddenly, Dolley's informal intelligence network took on new urgency. The social gatherings at the President's house, while maintaining their festive atmosphere, now served a dual purpose as forums for understanding how the conflict might unfold and what challenges the young nation would face. British sympathizers in Washington, while careful not to express their views openly, still revealed their leanings through subtle signs that Dolley had learned to read. A reluctance to discuss certain topics, an overly enthusiastic support for American positions, or simply the absence of certain individuals from gatherings, all provided clues about where loyalties truly lay. This information proved valuable in understanding which sources could be trusted and which required more careful handling. The declaration of war transformed Washington society in ways both subtle and profound. The elegant gathering rooms of the President's house, which had once echoed with discussions of literature and fashion, now buzzed with talk of military strategy and national security. Yet Dolley understood that maintaining the appearance of normalcy was itself a form of warfare, a demonstration that the American government remained confident and in control despite the challenges it faced. Her Wednesday evening receptions became more important than ever, serving as a crucial bridge between civilian and military leadership. Naval officers who had once attended purely for social reasons now found themselves in conversations that could influence strategic decisions. Foreign diplomats watched carefully for signs of American resolve or weakness, and Dolley ensured that what they observed conveyed strength and unity rather than anxiety or division. The challenge of wartime entertaining required all of Dolley's considerable skills. She had to maintain the elaborate standards of hospitality that had made her famous while working within the constraints of a nation at war. Imported luxuries became more difficult to obtain, but Dolley compensated by emphasizing American-made goods and local delicacies. French wines might be replaced by Virginia varieties, silk by domestic cotton, and exotic foods by regional specialties prepared with such elegance that their humble origins became a source of pride rather than embarrassment. Through careful management of her guest lists, Dolley created opportunities for informal diplomacy that formal channels could not provide. A British prisoner of war, granted parole to attend a reception, might find himself in conversation with an American general, leading to understandings about the treatment of captives that could never be negotiated through official correspondence. A French diplomat could speak candidly with American naval officers about European perspectives on the conflict, providing insights that would influence strategic planning. Dolley's correspondence network proved even more valuable during wartime than it had before. Letters from friends and acquaintances across the country provided a constant stream of information about public sentiment, local preparations for defense, and the economic impact of the conflict. A letter from a friend in New York might describe the mood among merchants affected by British blockades. News from Baltimore could detail the activities of privateers. Reports from Charleston would relay concerns about British naval movements along the southern coast. The information Dolley gathered went far beyond military intelligence. She monitored public opinion with the skill of a seasoned politician, understanding that civilian morale could be as crucial to victory as military success. Through her network, she tracked how the war was affecting different regions and different social classes, providing James with insights that helped shape government policy and public communications. As the war progressed through 1812 and into 1813, Dolley began to receive increasingly urgent reports about British military preparations. Her contacts in port cities noted the arrival of additional British ships and troops. Merchants reported disruptions to trade that suggested larger strategic movements. Naval wives shared their husbands' concerns about British capabilities and intentions. All of this information flowed through Dolley to James, often providing early warning of British actions that official intelligence sources had not yet detected. The role of intelligence gathering brought with it new risks and responsibilities. Dolley had to be constantly careful about which information she shared and with whom, understanding that a casual comment at the wrong moment could compromise valuable sources or reveal strategic plans. She developed an intricate mental filing system for organizing and protecting the intelligence she gathered, keeping different types of information separate and ensuring that sensitive details were shared only with those who needed to know them. The President's House itself became a symbol of American resilience during these challenging months. While other government officials sometimes fled Washington when British threats seemed most serious, Dolley remained steadfast in her commitment to maintaining normal operations. Her receptions continued on schedule, her correspondence flowed uninterrupted, and her intelligence network operated with increasing efficiency as the stakes grew higher. Foreign diplomats who attended Dolley's gatherings during this period left with reports of American confidence and determination that influenced their government's perceptions of the conflict. The French minister wrote to Paris describing the remarkable calm and optimism he observed at the president's house. The Spanish envoy reported to Madrid on the evident unity among American leaders. Even British sympathizers acknowledged the impressive display of national resolve that Dolley's continued hospitality represented. As 1813 progressed, the intelligence Dolley gathered began to paint an increasingly concerning picture of British intentions toward Washington itself. Reports from her contacts suggested that British forces were considering a direct assault on the American capital, a development that would require careful preparation and strategic planning. The informal nature of her intelligence network allowed her to gather information that formal diplomatic channels might have missed, providing crucial advance warning of what was to come. The British understood the symbolic importance of Washington, and particularly the President's House. Capturing or destroying the seat of American government would deliver a psychological blow that might prove as devastating as any military defeat. Dolley's intelligence network began to pick up signs that such an attack was not merely a possibility, but an active part of British strategic planning. Reports from Baltimore described unusual British naval activity in the Chesapeake Bay. News from Virginia mentioned British forces gathering in ways that suggested preparation for a significant operation. The summer of 1814 brought with it a sense of impending crisis that even Dolly's considerable skills could not entirely disguise. Napoleon's defeat in Europe had freed British forces for deployment to the American conflict, and reports reaching Washington suggested that a massive expedition was being prepared to strike at the heart of the United States. The intelligence flowing through Dolly's network painted an increasingly alarming picture of British capabilities and intentions. Letters from her correspondents in port cities up and down the eastern seaboard described a level of British naval activity unlike anything seen since the war began. Ships arriving from Europe brought not just supplies, but thousands of experienced soldiers. Veterans of the Napoleonic campaigns, who represented a far more serious threat than the forces America had faced previously. Dolly carefully compiled these reports, looking for patterns that might reveal the British plan of attack. The mood in Washington began to shift as summer progressed. While Dolly continued her Wednesday receptions with determination, she could not ignore the undercurrent of anxiety that ran through the capital's social circles. Military officers spoke in hushed tones about defensive preparations. Congressional wives worried about the safety of their families. Foreign diplomats watched carefully for signs that the American government might be preparing to abandon the capital. Through her intelligence network, Dolly learned that British forces had landed in Maryland and were moving toward Washington with ominous purpose. The reports were fragmentary at first. Sightings of ships in the Chesapeake, troops disembarking at various points along the coast, movements that suggested a coordinated campaign rather than isolated raids. As the pieces came together, the picture that emerged was one of imminent and serious danger to the capital itself. James found himself increasingly dependent on the intelligence his wife provided, as official reports lagged behind events. The informal nature of Dolly's network meant that her contacts often learned of developments before military commanders or government officials received formal notification. A merchant's wife might observe troop movements hours before official dispatches arrived. A naval officer's spouse could relay urgent information that had not yet worked its way through official channels. The challenge for Dolly during this period was maintaining her composure and continuing her social obligations, while secretly preparing for what seemed increasingly likely to be a direct assault on Washington. She began to make discreet inquiries about which government documents and artifacts would be most important to preserve in case of evacuation. Her questions, carefully disguised as intellectual curiosity about the historical significance of various items, allowed her to develop a mental inventory of what might need protection. The president's house had accumulated a remarkable collection of important items during the early years of the Republic. The famous portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart had become a symbol of American independence and continuity. Important government documents, some dating back to the founding of the nation, were stored in various offices throughout the building. The furnishings themselves, many selected by Dolly with such care, represented the young nation's aspirations to cultural sophistication and international respect. As August 1814 approached, the intelligence reaching Dolly through her network became increasingly urgent. British forces were definitely moving toward Washington, and their numbers and equipment suggested that this was not a raid, but a serious attempt to capture the American capital. Reports described well-equipped professional soldiers advancing, with the kind of methodical precision that had made the British Army famous throughout Europe. The American forces available to defend Washington were far less impressive than the approaching British expedition. Many of the regular army units were deployed elsewhere, leaving the capital's defense largely in the hands of militia forces whose training and equipment varied widely. Dolly's contacts among military wives provided sobering assessments of American readiness that confirmed her growing fears about the capital's vulnerability. Despite the mounting evidence of approaching danger, life in Washington continued with a surreal normalcy that reflected both American determination and perhaps a degree of disbelief that the British would actually attempt to capture the capital. Dolly's receptions went on as scheduled, though the guest lists now included more military officers and fewer foreign diplomats. The conversations at these gatherings centered increasingly on military preparations and defensive strategies. Through careful observation and discreet inquiry, Dolly began to prepare for the possibility that evacuation might become necessary. She identified which servants could be trusted with sensitive tasks, which neighbours might provide assistance, and which routes would be safest for leaving the capital. These preparations were made without fanfare or obvious alarm, disguised as routine household management that would not cause panic among the staff or residents of the president's house. The intelligence network that had served Dolley so well throughout James's presidency now became a lifeline for understanding the rapidly developing crisis. Reports flowed in from across the region describing British movements, American responses, and the growing sense of urgency that gripped communities. In the path of the approaching army, each piece of information helped Dolley build a clearer picture of what was happening and what might be required in the days ahead. As August progressed, it became clear that the British objective was indeed Washington itself. The symbolic value of capturing the American capital, combined with the military advantage of disrupting government operations, made the city an irresistible target. Dolley's network provided advance warning that allowed for some preparation, but the scale and speed of the British advance meant that time was running short for any meaningful defense. The evening of August 23rd, 1814, brought news that would transform Dolley Madison from a social hostess and informal intelligence gatherer into one of the most celebrated heroines of the War of 1812. British forces had defeated American defenders at the Battle of Bladensburg, just outside Washington, and were advancing on the capital with nothing standing in their way. The time for preparation had ended, and the moment for action had arrived. August 24th, 1814, dawned with an oppressive heat that seemed to mirror the urgency of the crisis facing Washington. Dolley woke to reports that British forces were within hours of reaching the capital, their advance unopposed after the American defeat at Bladensburg. James had departed to observe the battle, leaving his wife to manage the evacuation of the president's house and the preservation of whatever could be saved from the approaching destruction. The intelligence network that had served Dolley throughout the war now provided its most crucial service. Reports from her contacts traced the British advance with precision that allowed her to gauge exactly how much time remained. A messenger from Bladensburg confirmed that American forces had scattered and that no organized resistance stood between the British Army and Washington. Other reports described the systematic approach of the enemy forces, making it clear that this was not a hasty raid, but a deliberate campaign to occupy and destroy the American capital. With remarkable composure, Dolley began to execute the plans she had carefully developed during the preceding weeks. Her first priority was the preservation of important government documents, particularly those that represented the foundational principles of the American Republic. The Declaration of Independence, though normally housed elsewhere, had been brought to the President's house for safekeeping, along with other irreplaceable papers that documented the nation's birth and early development. The task of evacuation required all of Dolley's organizational skills and leadership abilities. She directed servants and volunteers in the careful packing of documents and artifacts, ensuring that each item was properly protected for transport. The process had to be done quickly, but without the haste that might lead to damage or loss. Every decision required careful consideration of what could be saved and what would have to be abandoned to the approaching flames. The famous portrait of George Washington presented a particular challenge. The large canvas was mounted in a frame that had been secured to the wall, and removing it required tools and time that were in increasingly short supply. Dolley refused to abandon this symbol of American independence, understanding its enormous, symbolic value to the nation's morale and identity. With the help of the gardener and a household servant, she supervised the careful removal of the portrait, even as reports arrived of British forces entering the outskirts of Washington. Throughout the crisis, Dolley maintained communication with her intelligence network, receiving regular updates on British movements and intentions. These reports confirmed her worst fears. The British planned not just to occupy Washington, but to destroy the public buildings as a demonstration of their power and a message to the American people. The President's house, as the symbol of American executive authority, would certainly be among their primary targets. The decision of what to save required painful choices. Personal belongings had to be weighed against government documents. Valuable furnishings competed for space with irreplaceable historical artifacts. Dolley approached these decisions with the same intelligence and strategic thinking that had made her such an effective informal diplomat, prioritizing items based on their historical significance and symbolic value rather than their personal importance to her. As the afternoon progressed, the sounds of the approaching British forces became audible even from the president's house. The disciplined march of professional soldiers, the clatter of artillery pieces, and the general commotion of an army on the move created an ominous backdrop to the frantic activity of evacuation. Dolley's contacts continued to provide updates on the British advance, giving her crucial information about how much time remained before the enemy reached the heart of Washington. The preservation of government documents required careful coordination. With other officials who were similarly engaged in protecting valuable materials, Dolley's network facilitated communication between different government departments, ensuring that evacuation efforts were coordinated rather than duplicated. Her ability to maintain contact with officials across the capital allowed for more efficient use of the limited time and resources available for preservation efforts. Among the items Dolley chose to save were not just formal government documents, but also personal papers and correspondence that documented the early years of the Republic from a more intimate perspective. Letters from foreign dignitaries, records of social and diplomatic occasions, and other materials that told the story of how American democracy had developed through personal relationships and informal diplomacy. These items, while perhaps less obviously important than official documents, represented a unique perspective on American history that would be impossible to replace. The task of evacuation was complicated by the need to maintain secrecy about exactly what was being removed and where it was being taken. British sympathizers in Washington might relay information about evacuation routes or hiding places, compromising the safety of the materials being preserved. Dolley used her knowledge of local politics and personalities, gained through years of social leadership, to identify trustworthy individuals who could assist with the preservation effort without risking exposure. As evening approached, reports from Dolley's intelligence network confirmed that British forces had entered Washington and were beginning their systematic destruction of government buildings. The sight of flames rising from other parts of the capital created an urgency that could no longer be ignored. The time for careful planning had passed, and the moment for immediate action had arrived. The final hours before the British reached the president's house required decisions that would define Dolley's legacy for generations to come. With enemy forces approaching and escape routes narrowing, she had to choose between personal safety and the completion of her preservation mission. The intelligence that had served her so well throughout the crisis now provided a stark assessment. The British would arrive within hours, and anyone remaining in the president's house would be captured or worse. Yet Dolley continued her work, with a determination that transformed her from a social hostess into a symbol of American courage and dedication. The woman who had once worried about the proper arrangement of furniture now calmly supervised the loading of wagons under the glow of distant fires, her composure serving as an inspiration to everyone working alongside her. The intelligence network that had begun as an extension of her social activities had become the means through which she would save some of the most important artifacts of American democracy. As the British forces finally approached the president's house, their torches casting dancing shadows against the walls that had witnessed so many of Dolley's triumphs, the building stood ready for its transformation from a home of diplomacy into a symbol of sacrifice. The intelligence network that had protected American interests for so many years had completed its most important mission, ensuring that the foundations of the Republic would survive even as its physical symbols burned in the August night. Had been years of war and smoke, of triumph and flame, yet the quiet years that followed would test her in ways no battlefield ever could. The presidency ended in March of 1817, and with it, the grand stage upon which Dolley had danced her careful choreography of power. James Madison, exhausted by 8 years of navigating a young nation through its most perilous trials, yearned for the pastoral silence of Montpellier. But for Dolley, leaving the president's house meant abandoning the very realm where she had discovered her truest self. The carriage wheels that carried them away from Washington in March 1817 seemed to echo with the weight of endings. Dolly pressed her gloved hand against the window, watching the Capitol fade into Virginia's rolling green. Behind her lay 16 years of transforming American society from the ground up, of making democracy elegant, of proving that a republic could possess both dignity and warmth. Ahead lay Montpelier, the sprawling plantation that had been James's sanctuary and would now become her exile. But Dolley Madison had never been one to accept exile gracefully. Even as the wheels turned toward Orange County, her mind was already working, already adapting. She had spent too many years understanding power to simply release it without a fight. The presidency might be ending, but her influence, carefully, cultivated, strategically deployed, lovingly tended like the finest garden, would find new ways to flourish. Montpelier in 1817 was both paradise and prison. The mansion sat like a classical poem amid the Virginia hills, its columns catching morning light, its windows overlooking fields that seemed to stretch toward infinity. James found peace here among his books and papers, finally free to pursue his scholarly nature without the weight of a nation pressing upon his shoulders. He would spend hours in his study, organizing his notes from the Constitutional Convention, preparing what would become his careful legacy to posterity. The former, President had always been more comfortable with ideas than people, more at ease with principles than personalities. Dolly, however, had always been the opposite. Ideas without people to embody them were merely abstract philosophy. Principles without personalities to champion them were lifeless doctrine. At Montpelier, surrounded by the bucolic beauty that soothed her husband's spirit, she felt herself beginning to fade like a flower removed from its natural soil. This was not her element. Her element was the electric atmosphere of competing ambitions, the delicate dance of social maneuvering, the intoxicating challenge of bending the political world to her will through charm and strategy. Yet she adapted, as she always had. If Montpelier was to be her new stage, then she would transform it into a theatre worthy of her talents. The first change was in the guest quarters. What had once been simple rooms for family visits became elegant suites designed to entice Washington's most important figures to make the journey to Orange County. Dolly understood that in the delicate ecosystem of American politics, isolation meant irrelevance. If she could not go to power, she would draw power to her. The invitations that flowed from Montpelier in those early retirement years were masterpieces of strategic thinking disguised as social courtesy. Senators found themselves accepting weekend visits that somehow stretched into week-long stays. Cabinet members discovered that the road to Richmond invariably seemed to pass through Orange County. Foreign diplomats, charmed by stories of the legendary Dolley Madison's hospitality, made pilgrimages to this American Salon that bloomed in the Virginia wilderness. Each visit was orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. Dolly would spend weeks preparing, ensuring that every detail spoke to her guests' particular vanities and interests. She remembered that Senator Clay preferred his coffee strong and black, that Minister Adams was partial to fresh roses in his room, that Secretary Crawford could not resist her cook's particular way of preparing Virginia ham. These small attentions, accumulating like compound interest, bound her visitors to her in ways that grand gestures never could. The conversations that unfolded in Montpelier's drawing rooms shaped the early republic in ways that historians would struggle to trace. Dolly had perfected the art of the seemingly casual question, the innocent inquiry that revealed more than hours of formal interrogation. Over tea and Virginia cake, she would draw from her guests the intelligence that kept her informed of every shift in the political wind. Who was rising in Andrew Jackson's estimation? What were the real reasons behind John Quincy Adams's latest diplomatic initiative? How serious was the talk of sectional division over slavery? This information she processed with the analytical mind that had made her such a formidable force in Washington. Then, with the subtlety of a master artist, she would begin to shape opinion through carefully planted suggestions, strategic introductions, and the gentle pressure of her considerable charm. A casual remark about the wisdom of compromise might reach the ears of a senator preparing for a crucial vote. A thoughtful observation about the benefits of national unity could influence an editor's approach to his next editorial. A well-timed introduction between two men who shared common interests, but different perspectives, might spark the political alliance that would shape the next election. James, absorbed in his scholarly pursuits, rarely noticed the extent of his wife's continued political involvement. To him, the endless stream of visitors represented the natural consequence of their years of public service. Old friends and colleagues naturally wished to pay their respects to the former president. That these social calls inevitably involved detailed discussions of current political developments seemed only natural. That Dolley managed to steer these conversations toward her own strategic objectives was an aspect of their domestic life that escaped his scholarly attention. But Dolley's secret influence extended far beyond the borders of Montpellier. Her correspondence, during these years, reads like a masterclass in the subtle arts of political influence. To the wives of rising politicians, she offered advice on how to navigate Washington society, advice that inevitably included suggestions about which policies their husbands might find it advantageous to support. To young men beginning their political careers, she provided introductions to established figures, introductions that came with her tacit endorsement and the expectation of future loyalty. The network she had built during her White House years continued to function like a vast, invisible web spanning the continent. A letter from Dolley Madison could secure a political appointment in Tennessee, influence a newspaper editorial in Massachusetts, or shape the guest list at a crucial dinner party in New York. She had become something unprecedented in American political life, a woman wielding genuine power not through official position but through the sheer force of her personality and the strategic brilliance of her social manipulation. Yet this power came at a price that grew heavier with each passing year. The constant stream of visitors, while politically necessary, was financially ruinous. Dolley had always been generous to a fault, and her standards of hospitality demanded the finest everything: food, wine, furnishings, entertainment. The bills accumulated like storm clouds, darkening the Virginia horizon of their supposed retirement paradise. James, with his scholar's disregard for practical matters, failed to grasp the scope of their financial crisis until it was nearly too late. The plantation's income, dependent on slave labor that Dolley found increasingly morally troubling, could not support the lavish lifestyle she maintained in service of her political objectives. Debts mounted with terrifying speed, and by the early 1820s, Montpellier itself was in danger. It was then that Dolley discovered another facet of her remarkable character: her capacity for sacrifice in service of larger purposes. Rather than scale back her political activities, she began the painful process of selling her most precious possessions to keep Montpellier functioning as a center of influence. Jewelry that had adorned her during the most glittering moments of her White House years disappeared quietly into the hands of discreet dealers. Furniture that had witnessed the making of American history was sold to collectors who could never fully appreciate its significance. Each sale was a small death, a piece of her identity transformed into mere currency. But Dolley understood that her possessions were merely tools in service of a larger mission. If selling her diamonds could fund another season of political hospitality, if parting with her silver could maintain her ability to influence the direction of the Republic, then these sacrifices were not losses, but investments in America's future. The Madison presidency might have ended, but Dolley's presidency, the shadow administration that operated through Salon conversations and strategic dinner parties, continued to function with remarkable effectiveness throughout the 1820s. The major political crises of the decade all bore the subtle fingerprints of her influence, though historians would struggle for generations to recognize her role in shaping the young Republic's destiny. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, that delicate balancing act that temporarily preserved the Union by admitting Missouri as a slave state while bringing in Maine as free, was negotiated in part through conversations that took place in Montpellier's drawing rooms. Henry Clay, the great compromiser himself, spent several crucial weeks as Dolley's guest during the height of the crisis. The language of conciliation that would eventually bridge the sectional divide was refined through late-night discussions over Virginia wine, with Dolley serving as both hostess and diplomatic advisor. She understood, perhaps better than any of the men involved in the formal negotiations, that the slavery question was a poison that would eventually destroy the Republic, unless handled with extraordinary delicacy. Her own relationship with the institution was complex and evolved over time. Raised among Quakers who opposed slavery on principle, she had nevertheless married into Virginia's planter elite and lived for decades surrounded by enslaved human beings whose labor supported her lifestyle and political activities. This personal contradiction haunted her increasingly as the years passed. In her private correspondence from this period, carefully preserved but rarely quoted in traditional histories, she revealed a woman wrestling with the moral implications of her position. "How can we speak of liberty," she wrote to her sister, Anna, "while we deny it to those who serve our tables and tend our gardens? Yet how can we preserve the Union if we force upon the South a change they see as destroying their very existence?" Her solution was characteristically subtle and long-term. Rather than advocate for immediate abolition, which she understood would fracture the fragile coalition that held the Republic together, she began working to plant the seeds of gradual change. Young Southern politicians who visited Montpellier found themselves exposed to Northern guests who spoke eloquently of free labor's advantages. Northern leaders who might have pushed for immediate confrontation were encouraged to consider the benefits of patience and compromise. Through countless such conversations, Dolley helped maintain the delicate balance that would preserve the Union for another generation. It was not a perfect solution, moral compromises never are, but it was perhaps the only solution that could have worked given the political realities of the 1820s. Her influence in this area, like so much of her political work, operated in the shadows, leaving no formal records, but shaping events in ways that traditional historical analysis consistently undervalues. The election of 1824, which saw the House of Representatives choose John Quincy Adams as president, despite Andrew Jackson's plurality, in the popular vote, also bore Dolley's careful influence. She had known Adams since his days as a young diplomat, had watched him grow from an awkward young man into one of America's most capable statesmen. Her support for his candidacy was not publicly declared. She had learned too well the importance of maintaining apparent neutrality, but it was effectively communicated through the social signals that comprised her political vocabulary. The strategic dinners she hosted during the crucial months before the House vote brought together representatives who might otherwise have had little social contact. These gatherings, ostensibly non-political celebrations of friendship in Virginia, hospitality, created the personal relationships that made Adams's eventual victory possible. When representatives who had shared Dolley's table cast their votes for Adams, they were influenced not by any explicit political argument, but by the subtle impression that this choice aligned them with the most sophisticated and well-informed elements of American society. Jackson's supporters, recognizing the role that social influence had played in their defeat, began referring bitterly to the corrupt bargain that had stolen their victory. They never fully understood that the corruption they detected was not financial, but social. The quiet power of a woman who could make political choices seemed like natural expressions of good taste and refined judgment. Dolley herself was careful never to celebrate Adams's victory too openly, understanding that maintaining her long-term influence required the appearance of neutrality, but her private satisfaction was evident to those who knew her well. She had helped engineer the election of a president who shared her vision of a strong, unified republic guided by educated, cosmopolitan leadership. It was perhaps the greatest triumph of her shadow presidency, the moment when her political artistry achieved its most consequential success. Yet even as she celebrated this victory, new challenges were emerging that would test her influence in unprecedented ways. Andrew Jackson's defeat in 1824 only intensified his determination to capture the presidency in 1828, and his supporters were building a new kind of political movement that threatened to overturn the genteel consensus politics that had provided the foundation for Dolley's power. The Jacksonian movement represented something genuinely revolutionary in American politics. The organized pursuit of power by ordinary citizens who cared nothing for the social graces that had traditionally governed political behavior. These were men who had never attended a diplomatic reception, who knew nothing of the subtle protocols that regulated behavior in polite society, who viewed the entire Washington establishment, including its most charming hostesses, with deep suspicion. Dolley recognized the threat this represented to her entire approach to political influence. Her power had always depended on the shared assumption that political leadership belonged to those who possessed the education, refinement, and social connections that marked them as natural aristocrats. The Jacksonians rejected this assumption entirely, arguing that ordinary farmers and mechanics were just as qualified to govern as Harvard-educated diplomats or Virginia plantation owners. Her response to this challenge revealed both the flexibility and the limitations of her political vision. On one hand, she attempted to adapt her methods to the new political environment, reaching out to Jacksonian leaders and attempting to draw them into her social orbit. Several prominent Jackson supporters found themselves invited to Montpelier, where Dolley deployed all her considerable charm in an effort to moderate their more radical impulses. These efforts met with mixed success. Some Jacksonian leaders, particularly those with social ambitions, proved susceptible to her influence. The opportunity to dine with the legendary Dolley Madison, to be treated as a gentleman by one of America's most distinguished ladies, was too flattering to resist. But others remained stubbornly immune to her charms, viewing her attempts at influence as confirmation of the corruption they sought to overthrow. The election of 1828, which brought Jackson to the presidency in a landslide victory over Adams, marked the beginning of the end for the political system that had nurtured Dolley's influence. The new president cared nothing for Washington society, viewed diplomatic protocol as foreign nonsense, and surrounded himself with advisors who shared his contempt for the established political elite. For the first time in her adult life, Dolley found herself truly marginalized from the centers of power. The Jackson administration operated according to principles that made her particular talents irrelevant. Social influence meant nothing to men who prided themselves on their common origins. Strategic alliance building was unnecessary when raw electoral majorities could be mobilized through appeals to popular prejudice. The careful cultivation of personal relationships seemed pointless when political opponents were viewed as enemies to be destroyed rather than competitors to be outmaneuvered. James Madison's death in June 1836 marked not only the end of a marriage, but the conclusion of an entire era in American political life. The last of the founding generation had passed away, taking with him the memory of the Republic's birth and the wisdom earned through decades of guiding its growth. For Dolley, his death represented a loss that transcended the personal, though the personal grief was profound enough to nearly destroy her. She had loved James Madison in ways that few people understood and that she herself could never fully articulate. Theirs had been a partnership that operated on multiple levels simultaneously: romantic, intellectual, political, and spiritual. He had provided the ideas and principles that gave direction to her social artistry. She had provided the personal, touch and human understanding that made his abstract political philosophy accessible to ordinary people. Together, they had created something neither could have achieved alone: a vision of Republican government that was both high-minded and practical, both idealistic and effective. The funeral at Montpelier drew thousands of mourners from across the nation, transforming the Virginia plantation into a temporary pilgrimage site for those who wished to pay their respects to the father of the Constitution. Dolley, draped in mourning black that somehow managed to make her appear both vulnerable and dignified, received the condolences of a grateful nation with the same grace that had characterized her approach to every public challenge. But beneath the public composure, she was struggling with questions that had no easy answers. At 68, she was alone for the first time in her adult life, responsible for managing not only her own grief, but the practical challenges of preserving James's legacy while salvaging what remained of their financial situation. The plantation was drowning in debt, the result of years of political hospitality that had prioritized influence over income. The economic panic of 1837 would make the situation even more desperate, destroying what little remained of their liquid assets. The solution she chose revealed both her pragmatic wisdom and her deep understanding of her own historical significance. Rather than retreat into private grief, she made the decision to return to Washington, where she would spend the remainder of her life serving as the living embodiment of the founding era's political ideals. It was a role that required her to transform herself from active participant to honored symbol, from political manipulator to revered ancestor. The house she established on Lafayette Square, across from the White House where she had once reigned, as the Republic's unofficial queen, became a shrine to the memory of better times. Young politicians made pilgrimages to hear her stories of the early days, when giants had walked the earth and political disagreements had been settled through reasoned debate rather than bitter partisanship. Foreign visitors sought audiences with the woman who had hosted the crowned heads of Europe and could speak with personal authority about the character of America's greatest leaders. These audiences were carefully orchestrated performances in which Dolley presented herself as the keeper of Republican virtue's sacred flame. She told stories of Washington's dignified bearing, of Jefferson's intellectual curiosity, of her own husband's patient wisdom. Each anecdote was polished to perfection, designed to inspire listeners with examples of the public service and personal sacrifice that had made the Republic possible. Yet even in this apparently passive role, she continued to exercise political influence through methods adapted to her changed circumstances. The young men who came to hear her stories often left with subtle impressions about the importance of national unity, the dangers of extremism, and the value of compromise. Foreign diplomats who paid their respects received carefully crafted messages about American ideals and intentions that influenced their reports to their home governments. Her financial situation during these final years was precarious in ways that would have been unthinkable during the height of her influence. The sale of James's papers to Congress provided some relief, but the amount was insufficient to cover the accumulated debts from their years of political entertaining. She was forced to sell Montpelier itself, the beloved plantation that had been the Madison family's seat for generations, to cover their creditors' demands. The loss of Montpelier was perhaps the most painful sacrifice of her entire life. The estate represented not only financial security, but the physical embodiment of her partnership with James and their shared commitment to Virginia's plantation culture. Its sale forced her to confront the contradictions that had always lurked beneath the surface of her privileged existence. The uncomfortable reality that her political influence had been built upon the exploitation of enslaved labor. In her final years, she began to speak more openly about slavery's moral problems, though always in carefully measured terms that avoided alienating her Southern friends. Her correspondence from this period suggests a woman wrestling with the recognition that the political system she had helped to build and maintain was fundamentally compromised by its acceptance of human bondage. Yet, she never advocated for immediate abolition, understanding that such a position would destroy any remaining influence she possessed and potentially accelerate the sectional crisis that she still hoped to prevent. The irony was profound. The woman who had done more than perhaps any other individual to make American democracy socially attractive and politically functional was forced to acknowledge that the system she had perfected was built upon an institution that negated its fundamental premises. It was a contradiction that would ultimately destroy the republic she had worked so hard to preserve, though she would not live to see the final catastrophe. Her death in July 1849 removed the last direct link to the founding generation and the political culture they had created. The funeral in Washington was attended by representatives of a nation that was already fragmenting along the sectional lines she had spent decades trying to heal. President Zachary Taylor, himself a Southern slaveholder who would die within a year, delivered a eulogy that praised her patriotism while carefully avoiding any mention of the moral complexities that had shadowed her final years. The obituaries that appeared in newspapers across the country struggled to capture the true significance of her life and career. Most focused on her role as a hostess, describing her as the perfect example of Republican womanhood, gracious, supportive, and appropriately deferential to male authority. A few recognized her political influence, but described it in terms that minimized its significance, suggesting that she had merely provided social lubrication for the serious business conducted by men. none of the contemporary accounts fully grasped what modern historians are only beginning to understand. That Dolley Madison had been one of the most influential political figures of the early republic, a woman who had shaped the development of American democracy through methods so subtle and effective that their very success concealed their existence. She had created the template for how politics would actually function in a democratic society, through personal relationships, social networks, and the careful management of public opinion, rather than through the formal mechanisms outlined in the Constitution. Her techniques would be adopted and refined by subsequent generations of political operators, both male and female, though few would match her combination of strategic brilliance and personal charm. The notion that politics is fundamentally about people rather than principles, that successful governance requires the ability to build coalitions across ideological lines, that public opinion can be shaped through social influence. These insights, which seem obvious to modern political practitioners, were largely her innovations. Perhaps most importantly, she had demonstrated that women could exercise genuine political power in a system that formally excluded them from political participation. The methods she developed, influence through hospitality, power through personal relationships, control through social networks, would provide a model for generations of women who sought to shape public policy despite legal and cultural barriers to their direct participation in government. Yet her legacy was complicated by the moral compromises that had made her influence possible. She had operated within a system that depended upon the exclusion and exploitation of entire groups of people: women, African Americans, Native Americans, and the poor, whose voices were systematically silenced in the political conversations she orchestrated. Her success in making that system function more smoothly had arguably delayed the reckoning with injustice that was necessary for genuine democratic progress. This tension between effectiveness and morality would echo through American political life long after her death. The question she embodied, whether it is better to work within an imperfect system to achieve incremental progress or to challenge that system's fundamental assumptions, even at the cost of immediate influence, remains central to contemporary debates about political strategy and moral responsibility. The civil war that erupted 12 years after her death represented the ultimate failure of the political approach she had championed. The sectional differences she had worked so hard to paper over through social diplomacy and personal relationships proved irreconcilable when confronted with the moral clarity that slavery's opponents brought to the national debate. The Union she had helped to preserve through careful compromise was ultimately saved only through the application of military force on a scale that would have horrified the founding generation. Yet even as that war raged, political leaders on both sides continued to employ the methods she had pioneered. Abraham Lincoln's success in holding together his fractious coalition depended heavily on his ability to manage personal relationships and shape public opinion through social influence. Jefferson Davis's failure to build effective political support for the Confederacy stemmed partly from his inability to master the arts of personal diplomacy that Dolley had perfected decades earlier. In the post-war period, as America struggled to define a new vision of democratic equality, women would increasingly adopt Dolley's techniques in service of causes she might not have supported, but using methods she had created. The suffragettes who fought for women's political rights, the temperance activists who challenged male-dominated drinking culture, the settlement house workers who advocated for urban reform, all drew upon the tradition of female political influence that she had established. The 20th century would see her methods adapted to new technologies and expanded social possibilities. First ladies from Eleanor Roosevelt to Hillary Clinton would exercise influence that built directly upon the precedents she had established, though they would operate in political environments that offered women far greater opportunities for direct participation in governance. The notion that effective political leadership requires the ability to build personal relationships across partisan divides, that public policy must be sold through social networks as well as formal channels, that political power flows through informal as well as official structures. These insights, which she had pioneered in the early republic's drawing rooms, would prove essential to political success in the modern era. Modern historians, equipped with new analytical tools and freed from the Victorian assumptions that shaped earlier scholarship, have begun to recognize the full scope of her political achievements. Recent studies have traced her influence through previously unexplored archives, revealing the extent to which her social activities served strategic political purposes. Her correspondence, read with an understanding of the coded language that women of her era used to discuss political matters, reveals a sophisticated political operative whose influence extended far beyond the domestic sphere where traditional histories confined her. These new perspectives have complicated but enriched our understanding of her legacy. She emerges not as the passive ornament to her husband's career that earlier generations imagined, but as an active participant in the political process whose gender forced her to operate through unconventional channels. Her story illustrates both the possibilities and the limitations facing women who sought political influence in a society that formally excluded them from public life. Perhaps most significantly, her career demonstrates the ways in which the personal and the political are inevitably intertwined in democratic societies. The republic she helped to shape was not merely a collection of laws and institutions, but a living community of relationships, networks, and shared understandings. Her genius lay in recognizing that these human connections were just as important as constitutional provisions in determining how the system would actually function. This insight remains relevant to contemporary political challenges. In an era when democratic institutions face unprecedented strains, when partisan polarization threatens the basic consensus necessary for effective governance, when social media has transformed but not eliminated the importance of personal relationships. In political life, Dolley Madison's example offers both inspiration and caution. Her success in building bridges across ideological divides suggests the possibilities inherent in political leadership that prioritizes human connection over abstract principle. Her ultimate failure to prevent the sectional crisis that destroyed the system she had worked to preserve illustrates the limitations of consensus building when confronted with fundamental moral disagreements. The house on Lafayette Square, where she spent her final years, stood for decades as a monument to her memory and the political culture she had helped to create. Successive generations of Washington's elite would point to her former residents as they passed, sharing stories of the legendary hostess who had once entertained kings and presidents within its walls. The physical structure itself became a symbol of a vanished world, a time when politics had been conducted through personal relationships rather than mass media, when governance had depended upon social consensus rather than partisan majorities. That world had already begun to disappear during her lifetime, undermined by the democratic pressures that she had simultaneously championed and sought to constrain. The political system she had mastered was giving way to something more egalitarian but less refined, more representative but less stable, more democratic but less capable of the subtle compromises that had allowed the Republic to survive its early crises. Yet the methods she had pioneered would prove remarkably durable, adapting to new circumstances while retaining their essential character. The recognition that political success requires the ability to build personal relationships, to understand and appeal to human motivations, to create networks of mutual obligation and shared interest. These insights transcended the particular historical moment in which she had discovered them. They would remain central to effective political leadership, regardless of changes in formal institutions or electoral procedures. In the end, Dolley Madison's true legacy lay not in any particular policy she had influenced or crisis she had helped to resolve, but in her demonstration that politics is fundamentally a human enterprise. The constitutional framework that the Founding Fathers had created provided the legal structure for democratic governance. But it was people like Dolley who showed how that structure could be brought to life through the daily practice of relationship building, consensus formation, and social leadership. Her story reminds us that democracy is not a machine that runs automatically according to its design specifications, but a living system that depends upon the active participation of citizens who understand that political success requires not just votes and laws, but the harder work of building human connections across lines of difference. In an age when democratic institutions face new challenges and threats, her example offers valuable lessons about the enduring importance of political leadership that prioritizes human understanding over ideological purity. The secret life of Dolley Madison was ultimately the secret of democracy itself, that behind the formal structures of government lies a hidden world of relationships, networks, and personal connections that determine how power actually flows and how decisions are really made. She had mastered that hidden world as completely as any person in American history, using her mastery to shape the Republic's development in ways that continue to influence our political life more than 2 centuries after her birth. And so, we remember her not merely as a charming hostess or a president's wife, but as one of the founders of American political culture, a woman who understood that the success of democratic governance depends not only on the wisdom of laws, but on the quality of relationships between the people who make and implement those laws. In the quiet drawing rooms of the early Republic, over tea and conversation, she had helped to create the human connections that would allow an impossible experiment in self-government to survive and flourish. The wind that stirs the trees around, Montpellier today carries echoes of conversations that shaped a nation, whispers of laughter that bridged partisan divides, fragments of music that accompanied the delicate dance of democratic politics. In those echoes, for those who listen carefully, the secret life of Dolley Madison continues its quiet work of reminding us that democracy is, above all, a matter of the heart as much as the mind, of relationships as much as institutions, of human understanding as much as political principle. Her legacy flows like an underground river through the landscape of American politics, surfacing in moments when leaders remember that governing is not merely about winning elections or passing laws, but about building the human connections that make democratic life possible. In every successful negotiation between political opponents, in every friendship that bridges ideological difference, in every act of grace that transforms conflict into cooperation, something of Dolley Madison's spirit lives on, continuing the work she began in the drawing rooms of a young republic, learning to govern itself with both wisdom and compassion. The stars that shine above Orange County tonight are the same stars that witnessed her first tentative steps into political society, her triumphant years as the Republic's unofficial queen, her quiet final chapter as keeper of the founding generation's memory. They have seen empires rise and fall, watched nations born and destroyed, observed the endless human drama of power and loss, triumph and tragedy. But perhaps never have they looked down upon a story quite like hers, the tale of a woman who discovered that the greatest power lies not in commanding obedience but in inspiring love, not in demanding submission but in earning trust, not in wielding authority but in building community. And in that discovery, in that quiet revolution conducted through tea parties and dinner conversations, through strategic seating arrangements and carefully chosen words, through the infinite daily acts of grace that transform strangers into friends and enemies into allies, Dolley Todd Madison had found the secret that would outlive empires, that democracy's true foundation is not written in any constitution or proclaimed in any declaration, but lives in the human heart's capacity to recognize the dignity and worth of others, to build bridges across the chasms that divide us, and to create one relationship at a time. The beloved community that is democracy's highest aspiration and most enduring promise. The silence that settles over Montpellier as night deepens is not the silence of endings, but the silence of seeds planted deep in the American soil, waiting for the right season to bloom again. In that silence, patient and profound, the secret life of Dolley Madison whispers still, teaching those who listen that the work of democracy is never finished, that each generation must learn anew the arts of human connection that make self-government possible, and that the true measure of political greatness lies not in the monuments we build to ourselves, but in the relationships we create, the trust we inspire, and the love we kindle in the human hearts that are democracy's only true and lasting foundation.